PBS carries a series called Closer to Truth. They explore topics in philosophy and religion and science, and specifically they go around and they interview various scholars in those areas in order to get their thoughts on different topics. And a few years back, Closer to Truth interviewed me on a variety of topics. Now, in their format, they tend to do rather short interviews, give you 5 to 10 minutes to talk about a topic that is much bigger than 5 to 10 minutes. And so what I thought I would do is I would share here with you, my audience, some of these clips and offer my own commentary on, well, what I had to say, so that we can take this topic and from there expand and springboard off of this very short treatment into a much longer treatment. So that's what you're going to get today. You'll hear me on Closer to Truth, and then you'll hear my commentary on me, Nathan Jacobs. I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. This first one I've picked is on religious realities and art. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and play our initial clip, and we'll move to commentary after that.
Nathan, we all appreciate the use of art in religious circumstances, houses of worship, etc., as providing beauty, as giving us a good feeling. But is there any reality, ontological reality to the art? Is there any way that art, is there a claim being made that art is somehow really relating to some the fundamental non-physical realities that tradition claims to represent?
Now I'm going to interrupt here before we get my answer on Closer to Truth. Robert is a great interviewer, and he's a really sharp mind. He asks great questions. He understands the issues at hand. So I like his approach. And just FYI, with these questions, all of this is completely off the cuff. I gave him probably 50 different topics I'd be happy to talk about, and I received no prep or warning regarding what he might ask me, even right before he asked those questions. So all of this is really, truly just off the cuff with him. I really do like this question that he's asking because I think it goes to a critical feature of worldview in general and religious worldview in specific. There is a tendency, because of an influence of mechanical philosophy during, modernity, empiricism and the mechanical philosophy more specifically, that we have a tendency to think of connections between things and, the real in sheerly concrete terms. And so this is reflective of that empiricist influence. So we tend to think of that which is real as that which is concrete, that which I can touch, that which I can taste, that which I can see, that which I can hear. And then catalog under either psychological events or mental constructs or social constructs, all these other things that are not concretely real. And that has a tendency to influence not just the way contemporary folks think today, but it also tends to influence religious folks. So it's not uncommon for someone in a religious context to identify the value of certain things, whether it's art in this case, in this sort of more psychological category where it has some sort of psychological benefit to it. It impacts the person in a certain way. It has a certain utility along those lines. And to really dodge the question of whether or not there is any sort of substantive connection between, say, symbols and the reality. And that's partially because our culture, being in a sort of postmodern context, having been so heavily influenced by the empiricism and mechanical views of the world that we're in, there's a real tendency to find yourself at a loss for how do you draw any sort of real or substantive connection between, say, a symbol and the reality that it represents. What's interesting here is that this creates a real dissonance in people's sort of lived experience. On the one hand, there are a great many folks who have this empiricist tendency because of the cultural, and historical context in which they find themselves in sort of a Western after modernity context. And yet they're uncomfortable with, say, occult symbols, right? They would find a satanic symbol written on their door unnerving. But if you're just an empiricist, why would that be unnerving? And of course, if you ask this question, and I have asked this question in like classroom context, for example, there's usually an attempt to backfill, right? It makes me unnerved because that means somebody was there or somebody with ill intent or something like that. And it makes this sort of projected out perceived future danger or something like that. But that's actually not true to the way it strikes the person. People are very uncomfortable handling occult objects. They're uncomfortable looking at occult symbols. These sorts of things are perceived to actually have some sort of power, reality, connection with realities. And yet within this sort of empiricist mechanical worldview where the only real things are concrete things of taste, touch, see, smell, it becomes difficult to explain how that would be. How can a symbol be connected with something when there is no sort of material, mechanical connection? What would be the mechanism for such a connection? How could it be connected when we don't have any sort of empirical tether between it and the symbol? And so I think this is a great question because it's really going to the question of saying, well, is there any sort of aspect of religious art that actually is tethered in a real ontological sense to the realities that it symbolizes or images, as opposed to just being a certain utility that it lifts up the mind or illustrates certain things or gives us certain feelings that make us feel reverent or set the mood or something like that? It's really sort of bypassing the question of saying, look, put aside questions of utility and psychology. Are there any real ontological substantive connections outside of just mere psychology or utility that connect religious artwork, symbol, sacred spaces, whatever it may be, with the spiritual realities that they symbolize or image? It's a great question. So let's get my sort of short answer that I give here.
Well, from an Eastern Orthodox perspective, the answer is absolutely yes. And the reason is because within the Orthodox tradition, there's always been a tendency to presume that there's a porous relationship between God and the world, meaning that while God is distinct from creatures, there's still something of God communicable to creatures. And the basic distinction that's always used here is the distinction between essence and energies. And the concept of energies originates with Aristotle, and then it gets developed in Judaism, and it gets picked up in these Eastern writers. But the basic concept is really to say that there's a difference between what a thing is and the operative powers that extend from that nature of the thing. So a favorite analogy that you find in early Eastern Christian writers is the relationship between, say, a piece of metal and fire. You put the metal in the fire, and at some point you can remove it, and it's glowing, and it burns things and all that. It's still metal, but something of the nature of fire has been communicated to it. It's taken up residence in it and can even be a conduit for it, right? If you used it as a branding iron, you could say, well, there's a sense in which the fire burned whatever you branded, but also the metal did, right? Because it's a conduit. And so in a similar way, there's a presumption that material things can in some way participate in God. And so part of the idea of blessing and setting apart these objects or artifacts as sacred, this comes through in the concept of relics too, is the belief that material things can in some way become conduits for God himself, right? For the what would be called the energies of God.
Okay, now I'm going to jump back in here. Before we get Robert's follow-up to this, I just want to touch on, well, a variety of things. There's a lot that I sort of touched on in superficial ways, which is not the way I like to touch on those topics that I'd like to take the opportunity to flesh out here. Just as a quick opening note, you'll notice that I had said overtly from an Eastern Orthodox perspective, which is actually not how I typically speak. So when I talk about systems of thought or figures or things like that, I usually try to keep them historically contextualized and speak in some sort of descriptive tone about them, right? So according to Thomas Aquinas, yada, 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 on Thomas's view, yada, yada, yada. And so it is even when talking about the Eastern Church Fathers. Now, obviously, folks know I'm Eastern Orthodox. They recognize that that if I'm suggesting there is a certain consensus of the Eastern Church Fathers on a certain topic, that I more likely than not hold that position. And that's true. But I rarely will identify it as Eastern Orthodox in that sense. That's not how I talk. However, the reason I do that here is because that's how Robert framed all of these positions. He made very clear that he was interested in my thoughts as an Eastern Orthodox Christian who is also a philosopher, theologian, an artist, filmmaker. And so that's really the context for why I spoke that way in this context, because that's how he wanted me to speak. So anyway, jumping into the substance of my remark, I started by talking about this porous relationship between God and creatures, or really, any sort of, creatures and other creatures too. It's not just God and creatures. There's a broader issue here, which is that there's a tendency, in keeping with that sort of modern influence, when you look at the mechanical philosophy, there's a tendency to see creatures as closed systems. And in this sense, I have sort of my mechanical movements that make up me, and I have boundary lines. And then external to me, there are other things that are themselves closed systems. And this is reflected in the very sort of crude push-pull mechanical way of thinking in those early sort of empirical philosophies. Whereas the Orthodox perspective, the perspective of the Eastern Church Fathers, is that we are open systems. Even though I am an individual who is distinct from other individuals, there is a real sense in which I, as an entity, am porous and am made to imbibe other things. I take in and I give off. I am in communion with my surrounding environment. And this should be rather obvious to us on just an organic level. The air I breathe affects my health. The quality of the food I eat, the quality of the water I take into myself. And so really there's a sense in which that porous nature where I take in from my environment, it affects me positively or negatively, and I give off toward my environment, and it affects my environment positively or negatively, not just in mechanical terms, but in some sort of ontological give and take. The Eastern Fathers see that same sort of thing happening spiritually, where it is possible for me to take in my spiritual environment, that I give off or receive spiritual energy. If I'm spiritually unhealthy, I can give that negative spiritual energy off. If I'm around demons, they can give off negative spiritual energy. If I'm around holy things, they can give off good energy, and so on. And so the idea is really just an extension of that way of looking at the world, that just as we're open systems that are in a give and take relationship, deeply affected by the things we're in communion with organically, so spiritually, we're in communion with our environment, and we give off and we receive spiritually as well, positively and negatively. That's the basic concept. Now here I go into really sort of two things, right? The main thing I start to talk about is the essence energies distinction, and then I start to talk about this concept of conduit. But before I jump into that, given the context here of, images, that we're talking about images, I think there's another aside that I'd like to bring in here that is a really useful piece of the philosophical puzzle, as it were, on this topic. And I talked about this in certain other articles, and I can link to some of those in the description here. But the idea is that the notion that man is an icon of God or an image of God is deeply related to the concept of communion. And this connects then obviously with art and symbols. It helps contextualize that. Plato, or Socrates if you prefer, Plato makes an interesting observation about images. He recognizes that there are a couple of different types of images. Some images are non-substantial, whereas other images are substantial. And what he has in mind here is something like a shadow versus, say, a reflection. So a shadow is non-substantial in the sense that what you're talking about is you're talking about a negation of light. And yet somehow that negation of light creates a silhouette that offers an image or a representation of the archetype, the thing that it images. But it's non-substantial. It's not a substantive thing. The shadow is itself a negation of a thing, namely the negation of light. Whereas he points out that a reflection actually is a substantive thing. And here, Plato, being somebody who's deeply interested in definitions, right? How do we understand things? This is, if you're familiar with Plato's theory of the forms are themselves, right? The archetypes that set the definitions, the natures, the essences, the boundary lines of what things are. And Plato is always very interested in this. What makes virtue, right? What is the essential properties of virtue? And so it's not out of keeping for Plato to go ahead and ask these sorts of questions about, well, what is the nature of that thing? That's central to the entire Platonic philosophy. And so when it comes to images, one of the things that Plato does is he notes this interesting feature of images, of substantive images, that is rather unique. He points out that when asking what is the nature of an image, let's say a reflection, for example, that the definition ends up being referential. Now, this is rather peculiar, right? When you talk about a square, you can offer an insulated definition, right? 4 sides, equal length, geometric shape, and so on. Whereas when talking about a reflection, for example, or an image of, there is always a referential feature. It is an image of, and then you need to fill in the blank. It is a reflection of, and you need to fill in the blank. And so one of the things that Plato recognizes here, which is rather odd, is that images are essentially referential. Part of their very essence is that they are in some ways connected with that which they image. There is a connection between image and archetype that is essential to it as image. Now, this is something that the Eastern Church Fathers pick up on and consider to be rather significant in their Judeo-Christian philosophy, because man, of course, is identified as an image of God. And so looking at the ramifications of being an image of God, they recognize that there is some essential feature of our humanity, us as images, that is connected with our archetype, namely God himself. And one of the things that they recognize about these images, in keeping with this notion of a connection between image and archetype, an essential connection for an image to its archetype, is that they recognize that images end up being susceptible to the attributes of the archetype. Images as images end up sharing in some sense in certain properties of the archetype. That might be shape, it might be the color, it might be the movement, it might be the affectations, it might be any number of things. But images do not only have a referential nature, but in that referential nature, they have a participation in the attributes of the archetype. And so here, what the Eastern Church Fathers see in man as an image of God is an innate susceptibility to divine attributes. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we can participate in those attributes to the same degree that the archetype can. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're susceptible to all of the attributes of that archetype, but that is one of the features that they see in images, is that they have an innate connection with not only their archetype, but the attributes of that archetype. Now, this is critical because when we get into the essence energies distinction, we start to have context for what it means to participate in God. So I start to talk about the essence energies distinction. I offer you that very quick overview there. Folks who have read my articles or my other letters have seen more extensive treatments of this. Here I'll offer, sort of a moderate length one. Basically, the concept of energies or energia is something that emerges with Aristotle. The term doesn't exist as far as we can tell until in Greek, until Aristotle coins it, and he's the one who fleshes it out and sort of determines the initial parameters of the term. And the context for this is early on, Aristotle is basically just drawing a distinction between having a certain power and using that power. For example, I have the power of sight. Am I necessarily looking at something, right? The distinction between having that capacity and using it. I have the capacity of speech. Maybe that one works better since sight seems to be so automatic unless we're closing our eyes and proactively shutting it down. I have the capacity of speech, but I can suddenly go silent. okay, now I'm using it again. And so that distinction between the sort of raw power and the activity of that, power, the use of that power, is Aristotle's initial distinction. But as he develops it, he starts to develop the distinction between kinesis and energia, motion and energy. And the reason he's drawing this distinction becomes important in his unmoved mover argument, one of his argument for the existence of God. But in the initial distinction there between kinesis and energia, what you have is the distinction between two types of activity. One type of activity, kinesis, is imperfect progressive activity. So, for example, I can build a house. And as I'm building the house, it goes through successive stages, and I can abandon the activity along the way, and the activity is incomplete. The house is not built. And this, Aristotle suggests, is kinesis. It is motion. It is a progressive type of activity with these sort of developmental stages, moving from incomplete to complete, or more technically, moving from potential to actual. And then what you have alternatively is you have energia, which is perfect complete activity. This is activity that is complete at each moment. I mentioned seeing, right? So when I look at things, it's instantaneous, right? There it is. I'm looking, the act is complete. And you don't have these sort of successive stages where I'm starting to look right now and I might abandon it along the way. Instead, Aristotle suggests it's an immediate, complete activity. And the reason this is important is because when Aristotle goes into his argument for the existence of God, his unmoved mover argument, he needs a term to describe perfect and complete activity. Aristotle's unmoved mover argument, I won't go through the whole thing, but the short version is basically this. Aristotle recognizes that our world has pervasive throughout it at every given moment, things that are moving into being. They're moving into existence. They are generative. And this means that, there was sort of a potential for them to exist, and then that potential moves into actuality as they become concretely real. And Aristotle's argument is that underneath that movement from potential to actual, there needs to be something that's fully actual, because sheer potentiality on its own is, well, it's not a cause, right? It's just that. It's potential. It's a potential thing. It's not an actual thing. Only actual things can serve as causes. So beneath all of that potential that's sort of bubbling up into actuality, there must be something that's fully actual and not undergoing that generative movement. And this is what Aristotle calls the unmoved mover, or his movent is the more technical word for it, as something that does not themselves move but causes movement. So this is Aristotle's God, and then he fleshes out all the details of what the attributes of that thing must be like. Now, the reason this is important is because if he's going to say that God does not move, and here he doesn't mean that God is inactive, but he means God doesn't mutate. He's not undergoing generative shifts from potentially something to actually something. He just is what he is. Then he also needs a term to describe the type of activity that a being like that engages in. Because if that being, right, if this God moves things by kinesis, then God does undergo potential to actual movements, incomplete to complete movements. And so the distinction between kinesis and energia became critical. So God operates, his movements are energia. It's not kinesis by which he moves the world. Now, this became really useful also in Judaism and Christianity. The Alexandrian Jews, folks like Philo of Alexandria, really thought energia was a great term to describe divine activity. And so it gets picked up in Alexandrian Jewish context. And Philo then, in particular, draws a distinction that Aristotle doesn't draw. He draws the distinction between God's face and God's back. I say Aristotle doesn't draw this distinction because for Aristotle, Aristotle's a deist. He doesn't think that God is sort of attending to the world, looking on what's going on, intervening, revealing himself, making free, personal engagements with creatures. The world is in many ways sort of just a side effect of the full and complete perfection of God. Whereas for the Jews, and obviously the Christians, God is very proactively engaged. He is a personal being who is attentive to creation, who's making choices about creation, who's interacting with creatures, who is revealing himself. And so unlike Aristotle, for whom God just is energia, right? That's actually what he says in his Metaphysics. God's essence is energia. He's just pure activity causing the world to exist. The Jews and then the Christians draw a distinction between God's essence and his energies. And this distinction is really identifying the fact that God freely interacts with us. So God's essence is this sort of abyss of divinity, what God is in himself, unarticulated. And the energies are the free expression of that. Now that may sound all very abstract, so let's try to make it a little less abstract. Philo himself uses the story of Moses, where he asks God to see his glory, right? And God says, "No man can see my face and live, but I'll show you my back." And he puts Moses in this cleft of a rock, and he covers him with his hand, and then he removes his hand, and he lets him see his back pass by him. The way Philo interprets this, because he takes it to be obvious that God is a spirit and does not actually have a face or a back in the way a man does. The way Philo interprets this is that God's face must be the divine essence, what God is in himself, whereas his back are the energies of God, those expressions of who God is, those free expressions toward creatures and things like providence and mercy and justice and miracles and revelation, which all those things are revelation. That's his back. That's the aspect, that's the expression or articulation of God that we do have access to. An analogy that I find helpful in sort of fleshing this out is actually the analogy of a musician, right? So if we have before us a musician, I always use Bach as my sort of stand-in example here. If we have before us a musician and you've never heard of Bach, right, as inconceivable as that is, and I start to say, "Oh, you've never heard of him. Oh, he's a creative genius," and I start to talk in very sort of, praise, laudatory, high and lofty terms about his creative skill sets. On the one hand, you get some information, right? You get the sense that I think very highly of him, and you've heard some grandiose things about his skill sets. But what that really means in any sort of concrete, articulated sense is tough for you to say just from that description. The best way for me to illustrate is actually to give him a piano or let him compose something, to do something that actually expresses out there in a concrete way that creativity. And then as he begins to express it, you begin to understand that creative wellspring. Now, what's interesting here is that neither you nor I can peer into Bach's chest and see his creativity in the raw, right? We can't see the wellspring of creativity from which those expressions pour forth. But what we do grasp are the compositions, the performances, those sorts of things from which it pours forth. And by those, we begin to understand something of that wellspring. And so in the same way, Philo suggests that this is the case with God. Nobody can peer into the divine nature in the raw as this uncircumscribable, indefinite, infinite something. But what we do know of God, we know because of his free expression of that nature. When God creates, that tells us something about the nature. When God enacts justice or love or mercy or providence, all of these things are expressions of the divine nature. And from those expressions, we come to understand something of the divine nature, which is the wellspring for those free expressions, just as we, with Bach, come to understand something of his creative genius as it's expressed in those compositions or performances or whatever it may be. So that was a critical development in Alexandrian Jewish thought on the essence energies distinction that was then picked up and echoed in, the New Testament and the Eastern Christians. We'll get to that part in a second, but there's a second development that really emerged amongst the Alexandrian Jews. And the second development had to do with the communicability of energies. So one of the favorite analogies down the road amongst the Eastern Church Fathers is this analogy of inflamed metal. The idea being that if you take metal and you stick it in fire for long enough, you're a smith, you end up getting that metal hot enough, it starts to glow and to burn, and you can remove it, and lo and behold, it continues to glow and burn even though it's outside of the fire. And the idea here is that something of the nature of fire has been communicated to the metal. Now, when it comes to the question of, well, what has been communicated? Is it the essence or the energies? The answer is the energies, because the nature of fire is expressed in operations or energies of heating and lighting. And in the case of our metal is not actually fire, hasn't become fire. It's inflamed, but it's not fire. It's still metal. But there are new operative powers within it, namely heating and lighting operations or energies, and those have been communicated to it via the fire, right? So it's become a conduit for energies of a foreign nature. And this sort of analogy is meant to convey the sort of thing that was developed with the essence-energies distinction. It was recognized that there are a variety of places in human experience, both organically and spiritually, where you see this type of communication, where there is some sort of operative power of one nature that ends up communicated to something of a different nature, and that something of a different nature becomes a conduit. The fire metal analogy illustrates it, but we can also see that in things on a spiritual level, things like demoniacs, right? The question being, demoniacs oftentimes have superhuman strength, or they have knowledge that they shouldn't have. They might end up having powers like they levitate or something like that. And these are all operations that are out of the ordinary for human nature. So the question is why? How does that happen? And rather than going with the sort of mechanical explanation you might have today, where it's like, well, the demon comes alongside and is applying additional pressure, or they levitate because the demon picks them up, or it's the demon talking through them with regard to this knowledge or whispering it to them. Those are all mechanical explanations. The more ancient concept is actually the concept of communicability, of them being a conduit, much like our metal and fire analogy, where the heating and lighting properties of fire are communicated to metal. So in the same way, the demoniac is energized by demons. Something of the operative powers of those demons that energize it, with whom it's, the demoniac is in communion, have been communicated to it. And so it is demonic strength that is now manifest within that conduit. It's demonic knowledge that's now manifest within that conduit. And according to the Alexandrian Jews who begin to advocate this theory, of course, demons aren't the only spirits where you can have this sort of relationship. In Second Maccabees, the Maccabees are energized for war by the holy angels, so they're actually empowered by the good angels. So humans can commune with angels as well, holy angels as well as demons. You also see this as the explanation for the prophets, right? How do you have prophets who display divine powers, rather than thinking of it as merely God sort of jumping over the prophet and doing the healing or doing the miracle or something like that? There's more of a conduit notion where the prophet is actually energized by God, serving as the vehicle for the divine energies that are enacting a miracle or revelation or whatever it may be. So that notion of communicability was really crucial. And with this, one of the things that you also see is that this brings us into that connection with the notion of image. I had mentioned that man as an icon of God was critical to this concept of communicability. The idea that an image participates in or is susceptible to the attributes of that which it images, of its archetype. Well, the energies concept offers a way of explaining what it means to participate in attributes of. So when talking about the attributes of God within this sort of Alexandrian context, rather than thinking of divine attributes as sort of essential properties of a definition, the way four-sided would be for square, the tendency is to actually think of attributes as energies, as articulated energetic expressions of the nature. Things like justice or omnipresence or omnipotence. These are actually descriptions of things that God does. He is omnipresent because he is actively, energetically present everywhere. His providence, for example, is an activity toward creatures. Justice is an expressed activity toward creatures. Love, mercy, things like those. And so when talking about humans as icons of God, there's a presumption that we as icons of God actually are susceptible to divine attributes. We are made to participate in divine attributes. We are made to image God. And in this sense, participate in his attributes. And this is also true by extension to the angels. And so part of the concept that you have here is that image archetype connection between God and rational creatures in particular is at work when you're talking about things like the angels themselves communing with divine attributes and displaying divine godlike traits, and then them conveying those godlike traits to humans, and humans themselves in sort of a prophetic office participating in divine attributes, that rather than this being a weird or out of the ordinary thing, this is actually the natural state of images of God, to be able to participate in those attributes. And this is actually goes to, the sort of more Eastern understanding of what a mediator is. There's a tendency in the West, again, I think partially due to, the influence of more mechanical ways of thinking of a mediator as somebody who stands between. In this sense, they serve as a mechanism for communication, right? Don't talk to me, talk to my attorney. The attorney is a stand-in who actually separates me from you in that conversation. Whereas a mediator within this more Eastern concept is actually someone who brings two things near to each other. It causes communion or facilitates communion. I mean, let's return to our fire metal analogy. If I take inflamed metal and I bring it near and I touch it to you, it's going to burn you. Right. And this is, there's a real sense in which you are now experiencing the fire. Now you're experiencing the fire via the vehicle or the conduit of metal, but that fire does not feel terribly far from you. The metal is serving as a mediator in the sense that it's brought the fire near to you. It's brought the operative powers of burning near to you. And in this sense, it's not a stand between where it's creating separation. It's actually a conduit where it's creating connection and communion. And this is really the concept of a mediator. Now, in the ontological sense, in terms of the hierarchy of creation and the structure of creation, in this sort of Eastern way of thinking, amongst the Jews and then the Christians, the idea is that this is the natural order of things. The hierarchy of angels is a hierarchy that is there in order to communicate God to the lower things. The highest angels are the most godlike. They're more godlike than the lower angels, and they are there to commune with God and serve as conduits to bring the divine light to lower things in that chain. And then all of these angels are also ministering spirits, to quote the letter to the Hebrews, toward man. And this means that they are meant to actually communicate in some ways God to us. So the Maccabees being energized for war is actually by the holy angels as opposed to by God directly, is still the Maccabees communing with God, but they're communing with God via the vehicles of the holy angels who carry those divine energies near to them, bring them near to them. And this is considered to be the proper order of creation, that things highest in the chain, things most godlike, things that are conduits, are meant to commune with God in order to bring that feature of God, that attribute of God that they're participating in, to bring it to things lower in the chain. Now, all of this, of course, is quite relevant when you start to talk about images, because the idea is that in this case, what we're talking about rational images of God, and we're talking about the fact that we are rational images of God make us susceptible to divine attributes, and that susceptibility to divine attributes is what makes it possible for us to be energized by God and to carry those energies to other things. But this philosophy of image and archetype also extends to other types of images. So this sort of robust notion of image, where what an image is essentially is something that is tied with its archetype, and that essential connection between it and its archetype makes it susceptible to the energies or certain energies or attributes of that archetype, becomes relevant not just to humans, but it becomes relevant to things like names, which are in some sense a symbol or a representation of the thing. It's connected with them, which is one of the reasons why you see throughout the Old Testament warning to not even say the names of the other surrounding deities, why there's such robust theology around the name of God. And there's other reasons for that, but that's at least part of it. And then it also explains things like symbols. Why is there a sense that there's some sort of connection, let's say, with the satanic symbol, to go back to the one that I use? Why is there a discomfort with that? Why is there a sense that there's something evil about that? Well, it as a symbol of things that are demonic does indeed, under this view, have an ontological tether to its archetype, because it is an image of, it is some type of non-representational image of. I talk about this a bit more in one of my Substack letters on iconography, which I can also link to in the description here, the one specifically about whether or not poor representations of Christ are in fact icons of Christ. But nonetheless, what you start to see here is with this robust notion of image and archetype, and it's not just a connection, an ontological connection between image and archetype, but one that serves a sort of conduit role, makes the image susceptible to the energies or attributes of the archetype, and in that sense, it can serve as a vehicle for it. You can begin to see how a robust theology of iconography, of relics, of symbology, of names can start to be fleshed out in this context. So this is all the sort of tacit content that is there in my much shorter response. So let's see where Robert goes after this question as his follow-up.
And these are decisions made by clergy, by bishops or whoever. Is there a certain level you have to be able to know what material thing should then transition from just its material thing to a not a representation of God, but as you're saying, actually having something of God instantiated in it?
Right.
Is that right? Is that a appropriate way to say it?
I think that's probably a fair way of putting it. Well, I think the first thing to understand is that everything, to one degree or another, already participates in divine energies according to the Eastern Orthodox viewpoint.
You mean everything in the whole wide world?
Yeah. So the very fact that we exist right now and are having this conversation are doing it on divine energy, so to speak. And so that you
it's
see
sort of a tautology if you believe in God. I mean,
well, so this is where you end up with a concept of really participation by degrees. Right, you and I are in some degree participating in God, but then there are these different unique types of participation. Miracles, if let's say we had Saint Elijah standing here and he performed some sort of miracle, that would be a different degree or a different type of participation of God.
Or getting me to carry a tune or something.
Right. Well, you tell me if that's a miracle, I suppose. But so on the one hand, you have that, right? You have the idea that there are these varying degrees and sort of unique types of participation that are what we call, holiness. Now,
so you have degrees of holiness in in inanimate objects.
Yeah. So a key part of this is that there are different. There are different energies of God, and there's different ways of participating in God, and holiness is one particular trait of God.
Is it the same kind of holiness in an animate object as an inanimate object?
Yes.
Same kind of holiness?
Yes, that's right.
So it's just mattered by degrees, but not kind?
In terms of holiness itself,
holiness.
Which is part of the rationale for relics, right? So one of the presumption that, well, this person became, such a godly person and manifested holiness, right? They manifested miracles, they manifested, understanding mysteries, things like that.
Therefore,
the presumption is that their flesh itself started to participate in God and should be treated as
and
holy.
their relics might be bones. Or...
It could be bones. Sometimes it's something that they wear, right? So you see this if you look in the stories about Jesus. one of the, which is, and this is critical, how they understand what's going on in the person of Christ. It's not just that Jesus says, well, I'm God, so be healed, right, or something like that. He touches people, and he talks about power going out from him. And sometimes people even just touch his garments, and something happens. And so the presumption here is that there's this certain, fluidity. To put it crudely, these things rub off, so to speak, right?
That's a reasonable extrapolation from those examples. So we have holiness, the same kind of holiness, different degrees in human beings and in various relics that, or art, pieces of art that are blessed in certain ways. Now, what about animate things that are not human, like a pet, like a dog, like the bishop's dog? Could the bishop's dog have any degree of holiness?
Yeah. You presume there that the bishop might be the most holy one. I should be careful with this remark.
That's true.
Let's say a monk. The monk's dog.
Yeah, a monk's dog. I'm following your lead. This is your territory.
Right. Well, this gets that sort of question does get into a broader concept that's at work in Eastern Orthodoxy that I think is critical to their understanding of the entire world, right? Which is the presumption that everything in creation is supposed to participate in God to the extent it's able. Now, what does that mean, that it participates to the extent it's able? I think a helpful illustration would be something like this. Let's say we have Bach right here. He's been reanimated, he's in the room with us, and we talk about this creative genius that's within Bach, right? But that's very vague, it's very abstract. What does it mean to take a look at that? Well, what does that mean, right? Perhaps I've never heard of Bach. What does that mean, that he's a creative genius? Well, the easiest way to find out is to give him something to play, right? Now, on the one hand, we could give him, say, a triangle, right? Well, he can't really do much with that. Now, he might be able to impress me, right? I might say, wow, I didn't know you could do that with a triangle. But it has its limitations. Sure. And then maybe we hand him a kid's xylophone. Well, he can do a bit more with that, and we might be, again, very impressed.
So I hear where you're going. I mean, you're talking about basically a sliding scale, a spectrum. So there's no cutoff with just human beings.
No. So the presumption is that plants, too, can, to a degree, appropriate to their nature, participate in God and be changed by that participation.
But that's sort of in this broad, general sense of your overall sense of the ontology of the world. But I'm talking about in the specific sense of increasing that through this blessing process, because the relic of the monk's garment at one point was not holy, or it was only holy to the degree that everything is holy. In the world, but then it became more holy because of a process, or an icon that was painted, and then the priest went through the process of blessing it behind the altar, whatever, and then it raised. Saying, can a non-human animal go through that process of more than its general holiness of just be part of creation? Can you elevate a non-human animal through a holiness process?
Well, I would want to draw a distinction here. There's a yes and there's a no to it, right? So I'd want to draw a distinction between what the church itself is doing and the religious rituals of the church are doing, and holiness in the sense of the ways creatures are generally supposed to participate in it. So the church is really, in some ways, this vehicle for making people holy, right? So that's what it's offering in its sacraments and things like that. It's a hospital, right? That is in some ways offering this sort of medicine of the corruption that is set into human nature, and so the things that are blessed are made part of that that worship, the act of the liturgy, right? This work of the people of worshiping God, and then there are these various sacraments that become vehicles for making the people holy. But the people themselves are then supposed to become vehicles. They are the primary vehicles for making the rest of the cosmos holy. So I wouldn't want to overemphasize a blessing process as if that's the primary means of becoming holy. It's more that what is supposed to happen is that man is supposed to be, and by man I mean human generally, that a human person is supposed to participate in God, and the church provides the vehicles through which that participation can increase and increase and increase, and then through humanity the rest of creation begins to participate as well.
So here, I think there's a real opportunity to talk about this doctrine of man as microcosm in the Eastern Church Fathers and the significance of that doctrine, because I really do think that gets into the sorts of things that Robert is asking about. And with a little more time, it's easier to sort of flesh out the ramifications of it. Just by way of context, he keeps on referencing sort of blessing rituals or things like that. That's because of an earlier conversation we had about liturgy, which I'm sure I'll at some point post and comment on that as well. Now, before I jump into the microcosm doctrine, just a few sort of loose ends in there. I did mention this whole idea that there is a general participation in the divine energies, and that's true. The fact that we are created by divine activity, by the energies themselves. Creation is upheld and organized and things like that by divine providence, which is itself an energy. So there are sort of inevitable types of participation in God just by virtue of existing. And so that's the point I was making there. And then also, just as an aside, where he was sniffing around the question of, different types of holiness. One of the things I did not say there, but I think it's worth clarifying, is that there are a variety of divine attributes. And I've mentioned those in this context, right? Justice, mercy, immortality, right? That's one of the energies we're promised in the gospel. And the reason this is important is because when Robert was asking about the question of whether there's different types of holiness, my answer was no. It's the same holiness. Now, the reason I say that is because I'm unaware of any passages in the Eastern Fathers or in Scripture where holiness is treated as a genus in which there are various species of holiness. Now, that's not to say that there are not a variety of divine energies. Of course, there are. But it's to say that, God's holiness is one thing, right? That operative power, which is then communicated to relics, which is also what's communicated to angels, which is also what's communicated to humans, to holy places, and so on. I think the more interesting question is the question that Robert is getting at when he's trying to figure out, is it possible for things like a dog to participate in the divine energies. And here, this is where I was trying to get a differentiation between sort of the possibility of participation in general, right? Creaturely susceptibility to divine energies in general versus, say, very specific church rituals by which things are set apart as holy. So here I do need to touch on a little bit of what was some of the background that Robert and I had been talking about before, which is the process by which icons are set apart as holy artifacts. Is a process by which they are blessed, set behind the altar. There's a procedure to them by which they are made to be holy as opposed to just common images. And that's one of the reasons why Robert was asking the question of, well, procedurally, could you do that with a dog? And here I was really trying to get at the difference between, well, there's sort of two different questions, right? The one question is the church in its economy and its operation here on earth as one who ministers to creation. The work of Christ has been given to the church in order to, do a procedure, by which you bless dogs and make them holy the same way you would icons. But even if the answer is like, no, there is no such procedure by which you would do that, that doesn't mean that dogs are, immune or somehow excluded from participating in divine energies. And that's the sort of differentiation I was trying to get at. And the reason I was trying to get at that and redirect to the microcosm doctrine is because it is true that within the Eastern Fathers, all of creation is made to participate in the energies of God to the extent that its nature allows. And yes, that includes animals like dogs, it includes plants, as well as humans and angels and the rest. And this is where I used that orchestra analogy, the idea that certain instruments in themselves have sort of natural limitations. I used the example of a triangle, or you could use the example of, a child's xylophone. They have natural innate limitations given what they are, that restrict the degree to which they can participate in the creative genius of someone like Bach. But if they're brought into an orchestra, then in that broader context, they are elevated in their possibility of participation. The triangle begins to participate in the genius of Bach to a greater degree than it would on its own. Well, something similar is at work within the Eastern Fathers in terms of how they think of creation more broadly participating in God. What they see in Genesis, in the Genesis creation account, is that God makes two types of things. He makes these earthly, organic things that are brought up from the earth and are, dissoluble and, that sort of thing. Whereas you have also these heavenly things like the angels, these heavenly, celestial, relatively immortal, more godlike things. And what you have in man is you have a merger of the two, where the same elements that were used to give forth the plants or to make the animals is taken up and used to shape man. And then God breathes into man from heaven, merging heaven and earth in man. And voila, you have a microcosm of everything that God's made. And the question is why? Why would God do that? And according to the Eastern Fathers, the reason is so that the lower things of creation, which have these sorts of innate natural limitations because they are not icons of God, might somehow participate in God in a greater degree than they could on their own. So similar to the way the triangle has innate limitations in its ability to participate in the creative genius of Bach, when it's brought into the context of an orchestra, it is elevated. Its degree of participation goes up. And so in the same way, these lower, more organic, mortal elements of creation are merged with these heavenly elements, right? This icon of God. And so in man, there's the possibility of these lower organic realities being metamorphosized and participating in God in a way that they couldn't otherwise on their own. Now, this connects with something that we talked about earlier. I talked about the concept of mediation in the Eastern Fathers, the idea that things higher on the chain of being, right? The chain of being, that there's these ascending things that become more godlike, ontologically superior. You have rocks, and then above rocks you have plants, and then above plants you have animals, and above animals you have rational animal, human. Above us you have this hierarchy of angels. The idea being that this hierarchy means things higher in the chain have a greater degree of susceptibility to God, meaning they are better capable of imaging God than things lower on the chain. So yes, a plant tells us something about God, but not nearly as much. It doesn't offer us an image of God the way an angel does or the way a human does. And so you'll remember that I had talked about this idea that these images of God, these things high in the chain, are not only susceptible to divine attributes, but they also serve as mediators, right? They participate in the divine attributes, they are energized by God, and they serve as conduits to bring near to things lower in the chain those divine energies that they participate in. And it's not that they stand between and serve as a barrier, quite the contrary. They actually are ones who bring it near, just as when I'm burned by an inflamed piece of metal, the fire is not distant from me, it's actually brought near. It's brought near so much that I am burned by it via the conduit of the metal. And so in the same way, what you see in this sort of burgeoning concept is the idea that the highest angels are the most godlike, and they serve as conduits for the divine energies to angels lower on the hierarchy, and those angels serve as ministers to humans. But also in this concept, what you have is that man as a microcosm, man as an entity that is not only an icon, but an icon merged with the organic elements that comprise animals and plants, serves as a mediator of the divine energies to those things lower on the chain. And the idea here is that the vision of the cosmos is one where the divine energies, the divine nature, cascades from the divine nature down to creation, pouring forth from things highest in the chain to things lower on the chain. And so in this sense, in answer to the question about a dog, can a dog participate in God? On the one hand, yes, you have generic participation. The dog exists. It's brought into being by the divine energies. It reflects divine wisdom and creativity and genius and all that sort of stuff. But when you're talking about participating in divine attributes, the dog is not an icon of God. It doesn't have things like free will. It doesn't have things like moral conscience. And so it can't mirror certain types of divine attributes. But if what the dog is made of, right, if this broader genus of animal is conjoined with something that is an icon of God, namely man, then what you have is this sort of orchestra-like possibility of participation, where the dog, even though the dog can't directly participate in God the way an icon can, the dog can, via the microcosm of man, be elevated and lifted up and begin to participate in God in ways that it otherwise couldn't. And this is the purpose of the microcosm. Now, what does that look like? There's another conversation where Robert and I talk about immortality, and we get into some of these elements. And one of the things that I talk about is, rather than merely speculating about immortality or metamorphosis or deification, right, being made God by participating in the divine energies, it's usually the concepts of what deification looks like, what participation in God looks like, is very grounded. You look at the resurrected Jesus and you start to see what metamorphosized, deified man looks like. What does it look like when man is freed from death and made incorruptible? Well, look at the resurrected Christ, because that's where you can actually concretely see it. And you also, with the saints, you start to see glimpses of this as well. So what exactly does it look like in the eschaton when all things are sort of caught up into redemption for plants to participate in God? What's the extent to which they can participate in God? What's the extent to which a dog can participate in God, to, keep with Robert's question? And my honest answer is, well, I don't know. I would prefer not to speculate, because I don't think it's really a sort of a priori question. It's not the sort of question you would want to try to answer without experience. But the fact of the matter is, we do get foretastes of this in stories of the saints. So if you're familiar with St. Herman of Alaska, for example, you have these stories of a bear that befriends him. And the bear acts in ways that are not very bear-like in that relationship. And the way that's always understood in the Orthodox world is that that's precisely because St. Herman was a saint. So the bear is in some ways recognizing something of God in St. Herman and being changed by communion with St. Herman. You also see this in other stories, right? There's all sorts of stories about the ways in which, the snakes on Mount Athos respond to the monks, people like Elder Paisios and the rest. So the idea of animals reacting in some ways and behaving differently towards saints is a relatively common thing in these stories about saints. And similarly, you have things like this happening with plants, where there are plants that grow differently around the hermitage of St. Herman, or, this place where this martyr died and there's a church there. There's these plants that grow out of it in ways that they shouldn't grow that way. And the idea is that that's reflective of, in some ways, those things being metamorphosized, being changed and transcending the typical way we see them act as mere organism, by virtue of participating in or coming in contact with holiness and the metamorphosized, deified saint. And so I suppose to the question, can a dog participate in divine holiness? The answer is yes, and it's made to participate in holiness through human beings. That's the very purpose of the microcosm doctrine. All things are made to participate in God to whatever extent they're able. And the whole point of the microcosm doctrine is to transcend those innate limitations that are in animals and plants, which are not icons of God. The same way a triangle transcends its limitations of participating in Bach when brought into the orchestra. And I think that's a fine place for us to stop. So I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast.